Greetings, everyone. A huge welcome to our global viewers from the Middle East Policy Council located in Washington, D.C. My name is Besma El-Hussein, and I am the Executive Director. While it is a gloomy day here in Washington, one of the things we are not gloomy about is the exciting opportunity to speak with Dr. Peter Jones, who is joining us from Canada. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you for having me.
Peter Jones is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa and executive director of the Ottawa Dialogue, a university-based organization which runs Track 1.5 and Track 2 projects around the world. Prior to joining academia, the author spent 14 years in the Canadian Civil Service, during which time he worked on the Middle East peace process, in particular the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group of the Multilateral Track. He has subsequently led several Middle East Track 2 projects. As a friendly reminder to our guest, our Journal Contributor Dialogue is a series designed to inform U.S. policymakers with the most current insight and analysis on urgent foreign policy matters in the Middle East. MEPC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with the mission to contribute to the understanding of the political, economic, and cultural issues that affect U.S. interests and the Middle East. You can learn more about us on our website, www.mepc.org. Our three pillars are our world-renowned journal, Middle East Policy. We are looking forward to discussing the article that Mr. Peter Jones has written that will be published in our spring 2022 journal. The thought-provoking discussion will be about his article titled, "A Middle East Cooperation and Security Process. Has the Time Come?" We are very excited to welcome him. And for our first question, Dr. Peter Jones, would you mind please, for the audience members who have not yet had a chance to read your article, as we have not yet published it yet, could you please give a brief overview of the main thesis of your article, the organizational structure, and what your points are?
Sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So the article really is a summary, if you will, of about 15 years of Track 2 and Track 1.5 projects that have gone on around this idea of potentially creating a Middle East regional security and cooperation system.
And actually, on that note, Dr. Jones, could I just briefly interrupt you? Could you please define what exactly Track 1.5 and Track 2 kind of diplomacy is for our audience members who may not be familiar with that terminology?
Sure, absolutely. Essentially, Track 2 diplomacy, and that's a sort of a term given to a broad range of different kinds of dialogues, is a process of bringing together people who are influential but not official to discuss sort of issues that perhaps their governments aren't yet ready to discuss or don't yet have the connections to discuss. So it's a place where people from countries that don't recognize one another, for example, can meet in an unofficial capacity, usually organized by a sort of what we call a third party. And so that's Track 2. Track 1.5 is when you have those kinds of meetings, but officials actually participate. Now, they often do so in what we call jokingly their private capacity. They come not officially representing their country, but they are officials. And so in our dialogues around this issue of regional security, we've had both. We've had sort of academics and retired officials in a Track 2 capacity, and we've also had one or two officials serving people in different foreign ministries and different governments around the region who came, but sort of in their private capacity. So that's really what we mean by that.
Excellent. Okay, so now if you can continue and give a little bit more background about the article itself and kind of a summary of the article.
Sure. As I said, there were these series of Track 2 and Track 1.5 projects that went on, which I had the honor to chair. And they really began when I worked at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, in the mid-90s. I had just left government. I had just left the ACRES process, which had ended when the multilaterals ended. And we began a process of bringing together people from around the region, including from some of the countries that didn't participate in ACRES, didn't participate in the multilateral, like Iran and so on, to discuss this idea of regional cooperation and security. Because in the ACRES process, we mostly focused on regional arms control and confidence building measures and so on. And I felt that we needed a broader discussion of regional cooperation and security. So we produced a report, the CIPRI report. It was produced in 1999. It was reissued in 2011. It's available online, which looked at the idea of how that might work. And then the second project was run under the auspices of UCLA, their ongoing series of Track 2. And we convened a group of people from around the region to talk about what might be the founding document, if you will, the charter of such an organization, if ever it could be created. And so we had several years of discussion and came up with one, which is published as an addendum to this article in the Middle East Policy Journal for the first time. And then as a third project, the governments of Canada and Denmark sponsored a series of meetings looking at how would you begin to implement such a process if it could be implemented. And so we had a series of meetings around the region on that, again, mostly at the Track 1.5 level. And so that was the sort of what I wanted to capture, was sort of the lessons and the thinking that went into all of this, and to sort of update it a bit in terms of today's issues and today's concerns. There's been a fair bit happened since this process ended, the Abraham Accords and other things like that. And so the article really runs through these ideas and presents them and talks about how they might work today if it were decided to go forward with this.
Excellent, thank you. And in the article, you mentioned that all of these meetings happened under Chatham House rules, so that essentially means not for attribution. But I was wondering, as somebody who was reading it, are you allowed to tell us, I mean, were there at least some of the Track 2 and Track 1.5 participants, were there people and representatives from the Middle East itself, or was this?
Mostly. It was mostly people from the Middle East, absolutely. I mean, there were a few people from outside the region, many of whom had been invited because they had an expertise on how these regional security systems work in different parts of the world. But no, the core group was from the Middle East, from Morocco to Iran.
Okay,
absolutely. Yeah.
That's really great to hear. And I understand that most of those meetings took place in Alexandria in Egypt.
In Alexandria, in Cairo, in Amman, in Tunis, in Rabat.
Great.
Around the region, Dubai. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. In your piece, you outlined that Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia all have processes whereby member countries develop norms and mechanisms to assist them in managing their relations. What geopolitical factors may lead to a more difficult implementation of such a process in the Middle East?
It's a great question. I mean, there's obviously the question of normalization and the reticence of some countries to normalize relations with Israel in the absence of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. And that's something we can talk about later if you want. Another one that doesn't get discussed quite so often is the fact that traditionally, at least, I think it may be changing now, but traditionally, many of the states and rulers of the region have been very jealous of their sovereignty. And the idea of sort of creating a kind of a regional mechanism to which they might have to surrender some of that sovereignty has been something that has caused them to have some suspicion. And in this respect, I think, this has often been referred to by many people who look at this as kind of creating the OSCE in the Middle East. And that's a kind of a shorthand, because the OSCE is perhaps one model of the kind of system we'd be looking at here. But of course, the OSCE contains things like human rights and all sorts of different things like that, which some people in the Middle East, some rulers don't find particularly comfortable. And so when they hear that, they get a little nervous. In our work, we've been very careful to always say that what we're looking at is the creation of a regional cooperation system, which has to come from the region, has to arise from the region. And that while other regions like ASEAN, the Organization of American States, and SAARC in South Asia, and the OSCE should be looked at because they contain interesting ideas and experiences, it really has to come from the region. You can't just apply another regional model and go forward from there. So we've been working on that basis for some time.
Excellent. Thank you so much for explaining that so clearly. So now, in light of that, how would you predict that regional governments who are skeptical of foreign influence within their borders and the Middle East to react to such a proposal or the role of extra-regional states and organizations within this process?
Yeah, I mean, we have talked an awful lot about that, because it's obvious that the Middle East is a region of the world where sort of certain extra-regional states and groups of states, America, Europe, Russia, China, have enormous interests and have an enormous presence, and sometimes that presence leads them to compete within the region over wider global concerns, but they're competing within the region, and sometimes it leads to states in the region to court these outside countries in different ways. So the role of outside powers in the region is very important. And it's really not possible to consider creating a regional cooperation system, a regional dialogue system that doesn't in some way recognize that, unlike other parts of the world where it really is the countries of the region who talk to each other, and there is no formal role for the outsiders. So after a lot of discussion and a lot of consideration, what the people from the region came up with was an idea, and not all agreed with it, but mostly it came up with was an idea that if you think of it in terms of concentric circles or rings, the inner ring is the countries of the region, and that's broadly defined from Morocco to Iran. And they are the directors of the process, they are the owners of the process. But then there's an outer ring of sort of selected countries and selected groupings of countries who obviously have interests in the region and who obviously affect the region very much, and who are affected by the region. And so they would be sort of observers, and they would be able to participate in some of the meetings as the regional countries allowed, and have certain sort of abilities to make their points of view known, but they would be there in observer capacity for the most part. And so when we looked at this in the project, the constellation of actors that we came up with as sort of constituting this ring of observers were probably something like the countries of the G7, the P5, and that of course overlaps in some respects with the G7, and some of the EU as an institution, not all the members of the EU, that would be unwieldy, and the UN perhaps as an institution. So some constellation of actors like that, sort of orbiting around the inner ring and having a capacity to sort of make their views known and to be part of the process, but not to direct it.
Excellent. Next, the Middle East currently has de facto and sometimes official coalitions and alliances. Consensus model deter regionally isolated states from participating?
Yeah, again, long hours of discussion about this over many meetings over many years. I mean, I think the key, and this is something the article spends some time on, is to recognize that there are different kinds of security and different kinds of relationships over security. And there are different kinds of organizations exist for those purposes. And so we talk in the article about collective and cooperative security. And collective security is essentially when a group of countries have banded together because they perceive a threat, and they've banded together to meet that threat. Cooperative security is when a group of countries have come together around a framework of principles, a set of norms, a guiding document of how they believe they should interact with each other, recognizing they won't always, but nevertheless, it's a framework. And they agree to have a series of ongoing conversations to implement that. And so what's important to recognize is the two things are not mutually exclusive. I mean, in Europe, you have the OSCE, which is a cooperative security organization, and NATO, which is collective security, and they coexist. And I mean, I realize today talking about security in Europe is a difficult thing, but nevertheless, if you look at it in theory, similarly in Asia, you have ASEAN and what's called the Five Power Defense Arrangement, which is a constellation of countries within the Middle East and Asia and outside it, and that's a collective organization. So you have these different kinds of security organizations which coexist. And certainly we've been, during the course of the meeting, several times people said, well, I'm not going to join this cooperative, this collective security organization or dialogue organization, which includes all sorts of countries with whom we have difficult relations. I want to band together with a few countries and perhaps some outside countries to meet that. And the answer is, well, you can do both. And historically, countries have found it useful to have both kinds of security systems working at the same time, because even as you may perceive a threat from another country, it's still, diplomacy still has to take place. You still need a mechanism to be able to talk to that country and to work with that country in a kind of a collective, in a cooperative regional setting. So that's really the kind of the dynamic. I mean, a second point I would make here is that certainly as the process went on, this set of track 2 dialogues, and in the years after, we've got to think about security very differently. I mean, when we started, we had just finished the Acres process, and that was largely about arms control and confidence building in a rather conventional sense. But where we are now is that the consequences of environmental change and how you mitigate that, the consequences of pandemics, the consequences of rapid social and economic change. These are key security issues, and they're recognized as such. And these are things that are causing governments great concern. So I think going forward, as we look at this collective and cooperative security idea, the cooperative security mechanism that I sort of imagine for the future in the Middle East may well be focused on a lot of these issues, on health, on pandemics, on cooperating to mitigate the effects of environmental change, things like that, social issues, political issues. That is a framework within which a more cooperative approach, I think, could flourish. There will still be a few countries in the region who will band together to oppose other countries they view as a threat. Okay, that's going to happen, but they can also have a dialogue to cooperate on some of these other issues as well. That's I think the key distinction that needs to be made.
That's really interesting. I appreciated in your article that you made a very clear delineation between what you referred to as hard security issues, and soft security issues, and that this forum might be stronger at mitigating soft security issues than some of the hard security issues, but even then it would still be a worthwhile organization to have. So my next question for you, to tie in the unfortunate circumstances that are happening right now in Ukraine, how do you think a NATO response to Russian aggression in the Ukraine, whether with the use of force or without use of force, would impact the image or the idea of collective security agreements around the world?
Obviously, that's a very important question right now. I mean, my guess is that unless something goes terribly wrong, there won't be an armed NATO response to this. I think President Biden and other NATO leaders have made it quite clear that unless Russia attacks a NATO country, which I don't think Putin will do unless something goes terribly wrong, there won't be an armed NATO response. But certainly the countries of NATO are, they're obviously seriously increasing their forces in the area on the borders of Russia. And I think NATO will be one of, not the only, but one of the mechanisms that will be used to coordinate economic sanctions and other forms of punishment for what has happened. But I think the OSCE will be just as important, and the EU and other constellations, the P5 at the UN, the Security Council. So I think that a collective security organization really exists. A group of countries have decided there is a threat, as the NATO countries did during the Cold War, and they're going to band together to deter it, and if it attacks, to respond to it. And I think that still holds in this case. Beyond that, how you sort of unravel these kinds of difficult situations we're in right now, terrible situations we're in right now, without using force, by punishing Russia for what it's done, if one can. I mean, NATO has a role to play, but other more cooperative and economic mechanisms are also very important as well.
Thank you. I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts specifically on the non-proliferation component of the dynamic that's shaking out right now between Russia and Ukraine, and the lesson that it gives to Middle Eastern countries. I mean, we know right now we're trying to negotiate a renewed Iran deal, and Ukraine originally had a nuclear weapon and then they completely disarmed. If Russia is successful in the Ukraine, do you think that it might teach the Middle East a very dangerous lesson regarding proliferation and non-proliferation?
Yeah, I think that could be one of the most unfortunate consequences of this. And I think in many ways, it's one of the reasons why it's so important to try to make sure that Putin doesn't succeed without bringing on a direct clash with NATO, which would be a disaster as well. So I think that, but this is not the first time. I mean, we've seen in the case of North Korea and other cases, when a leader gets or is believed to have these weapons, unfortunately, they are treated differently. And it does present a difficult lesson. I think where we see regions of the world that have managed to create nuclear weapon-free zones, such as Latin America and other regions, it's because within this sort of overarching framework of a cooperative security system, gradually the countries of that region have come to the view that they don't need these weapons, that they don't perceive each other to be a significant enough threat that they really need to resort to the possession of these kinds of weapons. But I mean, that takes a very long time. It can't be expected to happen right away. But I think, to return to the present moment and its impact on the Middle East, I mean, I think that unfortunate message could be reinforced. But I think, in many ways, Western countries are at least partly to blame for that, because these non-proliferation instruments, they do require obligations of those who possess nuclear weapons and so on. And we've been very reticent, or not we, I'm not from Canada, but other countries have been very reticent to actually move forward on those in the way that they were supposed to, the way that these treaties said they should. And they involve security guarantees and so on. And I often draw, one of the biggest problems for non-proliferation in the Middle East right now is when Iraq attacked Iran with chemical weapons, and the West did nothing, in fact, quietly helped Iraq. That sent a very serious message to Iran, but other countries as well, is that, these international instruments and agreements that are meant to cause countries to not possess these weapons and have security guarantees, we didn't enforce those ourselves. We didn't seriously look at those ourselves. So we have a lot of work to do on that. But at the same time, again, a cooperative security, a cooperative dialogue mechanism is one of the ways to begin to create a regional dynamic whereby eventually some countries feel they don't need these. But that takes a very long time.
So in your article, you talk about how essentially the idea of a regional security organization, that it could include, or rather it should include, countries that have long-standing tensions, competing interests, for example, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, potentially even a Palestinian delegation representative. How do you kind of see that dynamic playing out in a successful manner? Would they even join? Is there a way? How could it not just turn into another Arab League?
Yeah, well, certainly in our projects, in all three of them, we had participation from all those countries. Again, it was unofficial, but sometimes they were officials from those countries who participated in unofficial discussions. So there is an interest in sitting down and talking about these things. I think the key concept is inclusion, which means that, if you're going to define a region, however you define it, and we talk in the article and in the projects about how we define the Middle East, basically all of the countries of the Arab League plus Iran, Iraq, and Israel, Iran, Israel, and Turkey. That all of those countries must have a seat at the table when they're prepared to sign on to the principles that kind of inform the process. And so it begins from a process of being inclusive. I mean, the Arab League, it does what it does. I'm not criticizing it, but it's exclusionary. Countries in the region that aren't Arab aren't invited, and that's what it's there for. It's meant to be that. So the concept of inclusion is very important. The other concept that's very important to get this going is what we call geometry variable, variable geometry. And what that means is that probably in the first instance, and probably for some time, they're going to have dialogues going on at different levels with different groups of actors simultaneously as part of a sort of a cohesive whole. And so it might be the case that only a relatively small number of countries may be prepared to begin the official discussion, the track one official discussion of these issues. And they would form the core group of this regional dialogue and cooperation system. And they would develop the framework and all the rest of it. I think probably today more countries would join that than might have been the case 10 years ago, the Abraham Accords and other things like that. But still, it'll be a smaller subset of the whole. And some countries might not be prepared to join this because doing so would imply recognition of other countries they don't want to recognize or whatever. But then you'd have ongoing dialogues at the track 1.5 and track 2 levels, wherein they could participate. Without necessarily formally recognizing other countries, they'd be more informal discussions. And so you'd have this sort of set of different dialogues with different constellations of actors going on over a period of time, and until such time as people felt comfortable perhaps coming into track 1. I mean, the ultimate goal is to have the whole thing happening at the official level, but that can't happen yet. And the fact that it can't happen should, in our view, no longer be an excuse for doing nothing. There are some countries who are willing to talk. They should start, and they should start developing this system. So this idea of geometry variable, different constellations of actors, different levels of dialogue, different speeds, but within an overarching framework, which would be sort of directed by the countries who step forward to lead the process. And that, I think, is how you kind of tackle the inclusion issue, while recognizing the reality that there are certain countries that won't join right now. They won't join an official process. The other thing to remember is that when we look at ASEAN today, or the OSCE today, or the Organization of American States today, they weren't born fully formed. I mean, that's one of the key lines in the CIPRI report, the original report on this, is that no regional security system was born fully formed. They started with a small number of countries, and others joined as they were willing. ASEAN is an example. It started with, I believe, 6 members. It's now up to many more than that. And so what's important is to get it going, and for a core group of countries to step forward and begin a process.
I have 2 questions on that. One, I know these meetings that you're essentially summarizing took place prior to the Trump administration, but I would appreciate if you could speak on some of the dynamics that occurred during the Trump administration. So, for example, the Abraham Accord, and then also the blockade against Qatar. I mean, it was very groundbreaking historically that Saudi Arabia would essentially break relations with another Arab Muslim state, and then within the same time frame, normalize relations with Israel. And that clearly weakened what was at the time viewed to be a very stable Gulf Cooperation Council. So in light of witnessing that during the last administration, what kind of lessons can be gleaned from that experience that should be taken into organizing a regional security cooperation agreement?
I mean, it's an excellent question. And I think, every person you ask that will have a different answer, but here's mine. I mean, I think that these events really demonstrate, first of all, with the case of the Abraham Accords, that a number of countries in the Arab world who had said they would never talk to Israel officially until there was an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, although quietly they have done so for many years, but officially they never would, have come to the conclusion that their interests require them to do so. And that wider dynamics of the region are changing their positions on a number of issues, and rivalry with Iran, concerns over the potential changing role of the US in the region, whatever the case may be, that they need to begin thinking of a different sort of constellation of actors and a different way of looking at this. And so I think, in a way, although we can talk about normalization and its impact on all this in a bit, if you like. In a way, although many Palestinians wouldn't agree, I think in a way that's kind of a positive for the idea of a regional cooperation and dialogue system. It shows that many countries believe that they have to have this kind of dialogue with a country they said they'd never talk with before. And that's a positive, I think. Although I recognize many Palestinians won't see it that way, and we do need to talk about normalization and what that means. With respect to Qatar, I mean, again, that it was a very shocking event in the sense that the Gulf Cooperation Council had, very formal rules and very long-standing traditions and so on. I don't know to what extent a region-wide dialogue and cooperation system might have helped specifically in that case. I think that was more a case of bilateral diplomacy needed to work to resolve some different views, but certainly the idea of a broader and overarching set of regional norms of conduct. And here, when the article comes out, I would direct people to the draft charter. And that was one of the more interesting elements of this project. A group of people from across the region sat down together and sort of, we took in our mind, we looked at the founding documents of the OSCE and ASEAN and the Organization of American States, and they all have a sort of a statement of principles, a statement of these are the fundamental principles of our region, and this is how we believe they should be implemented. And so we said, well, what would that look like in the Middle East? And over the course of a couple of years, we had a series, and we came up with a draft. And that's just a draft; it's not official, but it's an interesting document in that it says that many of the things that people were accusing one another of during the whole issue with Qatar are not acceptable. As the basis of state relations in the region, undermining one another and all that kind of thing, all the accusations that were made. And so while, as we see, today in Europe, the OSCE principles are obviously not being adhered to by Russia right now, but nevertheless, they form a set of norms, a set of standards of behavior that countries are expected to live up to. And I would argue that even though Russia today, with its invasion of Ukraine, has obviously, violated all those norms, the response that you're going to see from the European countries is probably all the stronger because over many decades, they had all deeply internalized this norm that boundaries should not be changed by force. And Russia's done that. And I think the willingness to step forward and impose sanctions that are going to be painful for the European countries too, may be there because of this the perception of a violation of a norm. And so I think that over time, the establishment of a set of norms, of a set of standards of regional conduct that states expect of one another, it gradually seeps into the sort of the discourse of the region and the sense of what the region stands for and the sense of what is acceptable behavior. And so the kinds of incidents we saw and still see, it's not that they would be impossible. Of course they wouldn't. They still happen, but they become more and more difficult. And the willingness of other countries in the region to step up and say, hey, you've crossed a line, becomes greater over time. And this is what we've seen in other regions. But again, this takes a lot of time. It's not something that's born fully formed.
Thank you for that. So my final question, which you touched on a bit, was actually about your draft regional security charter for the Middle East. I really enjoyed reading it at the end of your article, and I was wondering if you could just kind of highlight the top components that you think are the most important specifically for the Middle East.
Well, as I say, all regions which have these regional cooperation and dialogue systems have a kind of a founding document, and so in many ways it reflects those, it mirrors those. So there are some key fundamental principles of interstate relations, non-aggression, non-interference with each other's internal affairs. And they're, in many ways, they replicate what's in the UN Charter, but they put them in a more regional framework. And therefore they make them not just the rules of the international system as a whole, but the rules of the neighborhood. Right. And that's very important. And then there's a set of sort of mechanisms, dialogue, ongoing dialogue mechanisms that the countries of the region will begin to establish a sort of a framework of ongoing dialogues around issues such as hard security, but also soft security. And it mentions in the charter what some of those soft security issues might be. And it's, environmental change, social change, things like that, gender issues, things like that. And there's a need to begin having an ongoing series of dialogues. But it also lays out this concept of geometry variable. It also lays out this idea that we recognize that not all countries will be willing to join all of these dialogues at the official level right away. Some countries may be willing to join an official dialogue on this issue, but not on that issue. And so by conceiving of it as a sort of a tying together a set of dialogues, by establishing a regional center to promote sort of dialogue at the track 1.5 and track 2 level, to be a space where people from the region can come from their governments, but in an unofficial capacity to begin to talk about some of the issues they're not yet comfortable talking about officially, you create a kind of a framework of dialogues at different levels, which eventually becomes a regional cooperation system, although we envisage that taking some time. It's not going to happen right away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for sharing your
Could I
very,
just could I
yes.
just add, if we have a moment? I mean, I would like to address this issue of normalization and the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and because many people have said, and this goes back to the multilaterals that I've worked on for many years, and so on, that until there's an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, there can't be a broader regional recognition of Israel and broader regional dialogue and so on. And I think that's changing. I think the region is changing. The Abraham Accords show us that that's happening. And so I think, as I said, this is causing regional countries to look anew at the patterns of their relations. But one of the points that I think needs to be stressed, and this is something we are running right now, the Ottawa Dialogue, an Israeli-Palestinian track 1.5 on sort of the security dimensions of a two-state solution, and what would that look like? What would the security annex to the Israeli-Palestinian treaty look like? And one of the things we're finding as we work through these things step by step is that Israel and Palestine cannot together secure a two-state agreement. They have to have regional collaboration. In the first instance, Egypt and Jordan. But even more broadly than that, given the way the region is changing with social issues and political issues and economic issues, other countries of the region have got to also assist in the implementation of the security aspects of a two-state solution. So I think you have to take the normalization argument and stand it on its head and say that, instead of normalization of relations and perhaps the creation of a regional security system as the kind of the end state of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, I think we cannot get to the end state of an Israeli-Palestinian peace process unless you have regional cooperation, unless you have a degree of regional collaboration in securing that thing. And so I know that's controversial. I know particularly some people in Palestine won't like it when I say that, but that's a conclusion that we're coming to in this other work that we're doing in this other project I mentioned. So I think that we have to conceive of this idea of a regional cooperation system as really supporting the two-state solution and the Israeli-Palestinian process, and not running contradictory to it. I'm sorry to take your time, but I thought that was an important point to make.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Peter Jones and our audience. As you all know, during COVID, we have moved the majority of our programming online, and a big advantage of that is that our speakers and audience can join us from all over the world, as is the case today with Dr. Jones in Canada. And with such an incredibly dynamic Middle East, you can rely on the Middle East Policy Council for trustworthy information and in-depth analysis. So please hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and like and share this video below. Be sure to follow us on Twitter for timely news updates, and keep an eye out for Dr. Jones' upcoming article in our spring 2022 Middle East Policy Journal. We look forward to engaging with you all again in the future.